The sweet, tangy aroma of honey-glazed salmon still hung in the dining room when the temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Clara Bennett set down her serving fork with a soft clink, brushing a stray strand of chestnut hair behind her ear as she smiled at her two children across the table. At 46, the faint lines around her eyes were the kind that came from 18 years of late nights, packed lunches, and quiet, uncelebrated love lines that told a story no one ever bothered to read. Her hands, still soft, but with the faint calluses of a woman who kneads bread and scrubs floors and turns the pages of other people's manuscripts until her eyes burn, rested lightly on the edge of the table. She'd spent 3 days planning this meal, picking out everyone's favorite dishes, polishing the silver, laying out the good china they only used twice a year. It was supposed to be a celebration. Graduation night. The end of one era, the start of another. She'd thought the hard part was over. "Here, Liv, Liam, have another piece," she said, reaching over to pile a flaky portion of salmon onto each of their plates. "I know you've both been surviving on cafeteria food and energy drinks for months. Tonight you get a real meal. And congratulations again. I'm so proud of you both." Olivia, her daughter, 17 and sharp as a freshly honed blade, dipped her head in that quiet, gracious way she had. Her dark hair fell in a smooth curtain over her shoulders, and there was a faint smudge of ink on her left wrist, left over from cramming for her final exams. "Thanks, Mom. This is amazing, as always." Liam, 16 months younger and built like his father, tall, lean, with a habit of silence that made people forget he was listening to every single word, just nodded once, his dark eyes fixed on his plate. No fanfare, no extra words. Just acknowledgement. He was the kind of boy who noticed everything and said almost nothing, who kept spreadsheets of household expenses in a hidden folder on his laptop because he learned young that someone had to pay attention to the details his father ignored. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was the perfect American family. Ethan Bennett, best-selling suspense novelist under the pen name Silas Voss, sat at the head of the table, a half-empty glass of bourbon at his elbow. At 48, he still carried the roguish charm that had made book tour crowds swoon, salt and pepper hair, a thoughtful furrow between his brows, the easy confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades being told he was a genius. His books sold millions of copies. Critics called him a master of psychological tension. Strangers stopped him in grocery stores to say his novels had kept them up all night. He was a success. And Clara, he'd long ago decided, was just the woman who kept his house running. He set his glass down hard. The base of it struck the marble tabletop with a sharp, final crack. Clara's fork froze halfway to her mouth. She knew that sound. Knew that look in his eyes, the cold, clinical distance, the faint tilt of his chin that meant he was about to deliver a plot twist he'd been rehearsing for weeks. It was the exact same expression he wore when he wrote the death of a major character. Calm. Calculated. Almost pitying, as if he were sorry the story had to go this way, but really, what choice did he have? Her heart stumbled in her chest, then settled into a slow, heavy thud. She'd been waiting for this. Not tonight, not on graduation night, but somewhere in the back of her mind, she'd known it was coming for a long time. She'd seen the text messages left face up on the kitchen counter. She'd smelled the unfamiliar perfume on his collar when he came home late from editor meetings. She'd noticed the way he flinched when she touched his arm, the way he stopped talking to her about his work almost 3 years ago. She'd known. She just hadn't wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Not when the kids were so close to finishing high school. "Now that the two of you are finished with high school," Ethan said, his voice smooth, practiced, like he'd recorded the speech and played it back 100 times to get the tone just right, "there's something your mother and I need to talk about. Something I should have said a long time ago." He reached into the leather briefcase propped against his chair and pulled out a thick stack of paper, bound with a single brass fastener. He slid it across the table toward Clara. The paper whispered against the marble. Divorce Settlement Agreement. The bold black letters at the top of the first page burned into Clara's vision like a brand. For half a second, she let herself feel it, the cold rush of blood leaving her face, the tight squeeze around her lungs, the faint, hysterical urge to laugh. 18 years. 18 years of packing lunches, of fixing leaky faucets when he was too busy writing to notice, of staying up until 3 a.m. reading his drafts and fixing his plot holes while he slept. 18 years of erasing herself so he could shine. She'd turned down a fully funded MFA program for him. She'd walked away from a book deal of her own when Olivia was born. She'd buried her own dreams so deep that some days she could almost forget they'd ever existed. And this was how it ended. With a stack of papers on a dinner table, in the middle of her children's graduation celebration. "Ethan," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What is this?" "Don't play dumb, Clara," he said, and there it was, that patronizing lilt, that note of gentle condescension she'd learned to swallow for so many years. "We both know we haven't been married in anything but name for a long time. You don't read my books. You don't get the world I live in. We have nothing to talk about anymore except the kids and the grocery list." He paused, glancing at Olivia and Liam like he was delivering bad news with a heavy heart, like he was doing them all a favor by being honest. There was something almost theatrical about it, the way he drew breath before the next line, the way his jaw tightened just so. He was performing. He'd always been performing, even when they were alone. "I've met someone else. Her name is Vivian Reed. She's my senior editor at Midsummer Press. She understands my work. She gets me, my mind, my soul, the part of me that's been alone in this marriage for so long." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The picture of noble suffering. "I'm not going to lie to you two. You're adults now, or close enough. But I want you to know none of this changes how I feel about you. Your tuition, your expenses, everything will stay the same. I'm still your father. I'll always be your father." Clara stared at him. It was such a perfect script. The brilliant, tortured artist, trapped in a loveless marriage to a boring, ordinary housewife, finally brave enough to chase true love once his children were grown. He'd probably rewritten this speech a dozen times in his head, tweaking the dialogue, polishing the monologue until it sounded just heroic enough, just tragic enough. He thought he was the protagonist of this story. He thought everyone would see it his way. He thought he knew exactly how the scene would play out. She would cry. She would beg. She would scream and throw things and make a fool of herself. A woman who'd spent 18 years out of the workforce, who'd given up everything for him, what other cards could she possibly have? She was helpless. That was the whole point of the script. The helpless, abandoned wife, crumbling before the great man's truth. He'd been generous, too, in his own mind. The settlement gave her the small 2-bedroom house in the older part of town, the one they'd bought right after they got married, plus $120,000 in cash. Enough, he thought, for a woman like her to live on for the rest of her life. She should be grateful, really. A lot of men in his position would have left her with far less. He waited for the breakdown. It never came. The dining room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Liam wiped his mouth with his napkin, slow and methodical, like his father hadn't just announced he was blowing up their entire family. His face was completely blank. No shock, no anger, no sadness. It was the same face he wore when he was debugging a piece of code, when he was working through a problem step by step until it made sense. Olivia set down her fork. She folded her hands in her lap, sat up straight, and looked her father dead in the eye. There was no anger in her face. No tears. No teenage drama. Just a calm, clear, unflinching gaze that made Ethan's skin prickle with something he couldn't quite name. It was the same look Clara got sometimes, when she'd read one of his manuscripts and found a plot hole so big you could drive a truck through it. The look of someone who knows exactly what's going on, and has known for a very long time. "Dad," she said, her voice even, not too loud, not too soft, cutting through the silence like a knife through butter. "You say Mom doesn't understand your writing. That she can't reach your soul." She tilted her head slightly, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. "Do you even know who she is?" Ethan's brow furrowed. Annoyance flickered across his face. He didn't like being interrupted. He didn't like his carefully crafted scene derailing before it even got to the good part. "Olivia, this is an adult conversation. Mom graduated from Stanford with a degree in comparative literature. Olivia cut him off, every word sharp and precise, like she'd been practicing them too. She won the National Collegiate Fiction Award her senior year. First place. Her novella was published in the Southern Review before she was 22. The chair of the writing department called her the most promising voice of her generation. She paused, letting that sink in. Vivian Reed has been editing for 8 years. How many stories has she published under her own name? Any at all? How many awards has she won? The air in the room turned thick enough to chew. Ethan's mouth went dry. Stanford. The Fiction Award. The Southern Review. He stared at Clara like he'd never seen her before. It was true. He knew it was true. He'd known it once, a lifetime ago, when they were still in college, and she was the one everyone said was going to be the literary star. Back then, he'd been the one chasing her, the one who sat in the back of her workshops just to hear her talk about character and structure, the one who'd felt like he'd won the lottery when she agreed to go out with him. She was brilliant. Fiercely, effortlessly brilliant. He'd loved that about her once. But somewhere along the way, sometime between the wedding and the first baby and the first book deal, he'd forgotten. Or maybe he'd stopped letting himself remember. Because if she was that talented, that brilliant, then what did that say about him? What did it say about the way he'd treated her, about all the nights he'd come home and complained about his day and never once asked her about hers? What did it say about the fact that his most successful book was the one she'd helped him build from the ground up? It was easier to think of her as ordinary. Easier to believe she'd never had anything to give up. Easier to tell himself that he was the one who'd sacrificed, the one who'd worked hard while she sat at home and folded laundry. "That's enough, Olivia," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. There was an edge of panic under the anger, and he hated it. "Your mother made her choices. She chose to stay home with you too. She hasn't written anything in almost 20 years. That life is behind her. Because you weren't worth it." The voice came from Liam. The boy took off his wire-rimmed glasses and wiped them on the hem of his shirt, slow and deliberate. When he put them back on, his gaze was cool, mathematical, like he was solving a problem and Ethan was just a faulty variable. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. But his words landed harder than any shout ever could. "A man who doesn't even bother to learn his own wife's story," he said, "has no business talking about souls." Ethan's face flushed hot, then cold. He opened his mouth to snap at them, to tell them they were children and they didn't understand how the real world worked, but Olivia was already reaching into her backpack. She pulled out a thick manila envelope, sealed with a piece of tape, and slid it across the table. It came to rest right next to the divorce papers, a quiet counterproposal. "That $300,000 that hit your studio account 3 years ago," she said, and her voice never wavered. She was laying out evidence, one piece at a time, like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "The one you said was a film option from Midsummer Press. The one you told Mom didn't exist because it fell through at the last minute." Ethan's blood turned to ice. Every muscle in his body locked up. For a second, he couldn't breathe. How did she know about that? How could she possibly know? He'd been so careful. He'd moved the money through 3 different accounts. He'd told Vivian a dozen times to make sure there was no paper trail. "It wasn't a film option," Olivia said, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes now, disappointment mostly. Like she'd wanted to be wrong. "It was the audiobook rights for The Abyss. Sold to Broadview Media. Vivian brokered the deal. She handled all the paperwork. She made sure the contract only had your name on it. She tapped the envelope once with her index finger. Asterisk The Abyss asterisk is a co-credited work. You and Mom wrote it together. According to the original draft agreement from 5 years ago, 200,000 of that 300 belongs to her. You took it anyway. You used it for the down payment on Vivian's condo in the West End." She met his eyes, steady as a stone. "Am I wrong?" The dining room might as well have been plunged underwater. Sound got thick and slow. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, loud and panicked. The Abyss. His magnum opus. The book that had made his career. The one critics called a masterclass in suspense, a novel that digs into the dark corners of the human heart and doesn't flinch. It had sold over 2 million copies. It had won every major award in the genre. It was the reason he was a household name, the reason he could afford this house, this lifestyle, the fancy bourbon and the leather briefcase, and the editor he called his soulmate. And he knew. He'd always known. He remembered that winter, 5 years ago. He'd been stuck for months. Halfway through the manuscript, and the whole thing had fallen apart. He'd killed off 3 suspects already, and the real villain felt flat, cartoonish, like a cardboard cutout of a bad guy. He'd locked himself in his study for 7 straight days, crumpling up pages and throwing them across the room, screaming into his pillows, convinced he was washed up, that he'd never write anything good again. He'd been cruel that week, snapping at Clara when she brought him food, growling at the kids when they made too much noise downstairs. He'd been a monster, and he'd expected everyone to put up with it because he was an artist, because he was suffering for his craft. He remembered the night she'd come in, around 2 in the morning. She'd been wearing that faded blue flannel he'd bought her for Christmas the year before, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she'd been carrying a bowl of chicken noodle soup, still steaming. She'd set it down on his desk without a word, and then she'd glanced at his computer screen, at the mess of words he'd been staring at for hours. She'd stood there for a long time, quiet, just reading. He'd been ready to snap at her, to tell her to get out, that she wouldn't get it anyway. But then she'd spoken, soft and sure, and her voice had cut right through all the noise in his head. "Ethan," she'd said, "what if the villain isn't driven by hate?" He'd blinked. What else would drive someone to plan something for 20 years? "Regret," she'd said. "Not hate. Hate burns out. Regret festers. It eats at you, slow and quiet, until you don't recognize yourself anymore. Someone who's been wronged, who gave up everything for someone else and got nothing back, they don't want revenge. They want to be seen." She'd picked up a pencil and scribbled a few lines on the back of a crumpled draft page, her handwriting small and neat. Asterisk, they don't want to destroy the person who hurt them. They want them to look. To finally look, and see exactly what they did. Asterisk. He'd stared at those words for a long time. Something had clicked into place, sharp and bright, and suddenly the whole ending made sense. The villain wasn't a monster. She was a woman who'd been erased. And her whole plan, every brutal, perfect step of it, was just a way to force the man who'd erased her to finally pay attention. It had been brilliant. The best idea he'd ever had, and it hadn't been his at all. When the book came out and became a smash hit, he'd held her in the kitchen and kissed her forehead, and he'd said, "This book is half yours, Clara. I swear. As soon as the paperback edition comes out, I'll add your name to the title page. We'll do it together." She'd smiled and shaken her head, and she'd said, "It's okay. We're a team. It doesn't matter whose name is on the cover." He'd let her say that. He'd let her be the bigger person. And then he'd never brought it up again. 5 years. 5 years of awards and interviews and book tours, and he'd never once mentioned her name. He'd told everyone the idea had come to him in a dream, that it was all his, the product of his own brilliant mind. He'd let the whole world believe he was a genius. And she'd never said a word. "How do you know about any of this?" Ethan said, and his voice came out hoarse, like he'd been screaming. Olivia didn't answer. She just opened the envelope and pulled out a single black debit card, laying it flat on the table between the divorce papers and the manila envelope. "This card has the $200,000 that belongs to Mom," she said. "I called the realtor yesterday. Vivian's condo deal fell through. The down payment was refunded this morning. The money's back where it belongs." She looked at him, and there was no triumph in her face. Just a quiet, tired sadness. "Also, as your daughter, I feel like I should tell you. The book's at your studio? The payments between you and Midsummer Press? There are some irregularities. A lot of consulting fees and creative services that don't have any receipts. If you try to push this divorce settlement as it is, Mom has every right to request a full financial audit of your personal income and your business accounts." She paused. "I don't think you want that." Cold sweat broke out across Ethan's back. A full audit. The words hung in the air like a guillotine. He knew his books were messy. He'd always been terrible with money, with taxes, with the boring, practical side of being a writer. Vivian had offered to handle it all for him, to set up the studio account, to move money around so he'd pay less in taxes. He'd let her. He'd trusted her. He'd thought she was taking care of him. Now he realized how stupid that had been. If an auditor started digging, they'd find more than just the $300,000. They'd find years of questionable expenses, of cash payments, of things he couldn't explain. Things that could get him fined. Things that could get him sued. Things that could ruin him. He looked wildly at Clara, searching her face for some sign of malice, some hint of satisfaction, a smirk, a glint of victory. Anything to prove she'd been plotting this all along, that she was the villain of his story. But there was nothing. Just that same quiet calm, that same soft, steady gaze she'd always had. And under it, just for a second, he saw something else. Pity. She pitied him. "Clara," he said, and his voice cracked. "You put them up to this? You told them to dig into my finances? You've been planning this how long?" She shook her head slowly. "Ethan," she said, and her voice was soft, but every word was clear, sharp as glass. "I never told them any of this. I never said a word." She glanced at Olivia and Liam, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, pride, and a little bit of pain, like she was sorry they'd had to learn all of this, sorry they'd had to grow up so fast. "They figured it out on their own," she said. "They pay attention. More than you ever did." Ethan stared at her. He stared at his children, sitting there on either side of her, calm and united, and he realized with a jolt that he didn't know them at all. He didn't know Olivia was capable of this kind of quiet, ruthless strategy. He didn't know Liam understood finance well enough to spot irregularities in corporate accounts. He didn't know either of them had been paying attention to his business, to his lies, to the way he'd been treating their mother. He'd been so busy being the great writer, the genius, the man with the soulmate editor, that he'd missed his own children growing up. "The Abyss is the best book you'll ever write," Olivia said, and her voice was quieter now, almost gentle. Like she was breaking bad news to someone who didn't want to hear it. "But have you ever stopped to think? You never would have finished it without her." It hit him like a slap across the face. He opened his mouth to argue, to say that it was his book, his characters, his hard work, that she'd just made one little suggestion. But the words died in his throat. Because he knew it wasn't true. He knew she'd done more than that. She'd stayed up with him night after night, reading every chapter, pointing out plot holes, helping him fix the pacing, rewriting entire sections of dialogue when his fell flat. She'd been his first editor, his best critic, his secret weapon. And he'd never thanked her. He'd never even told anyone she'd been there. "Liv, you don't understand," he said, fumbling for words, for some way to make this right, some way to get control of the room again. "Writing is complicated. Vivian and we have a connection. It's not just soulmates," Liam said, and there was a faint, dry edge to his voice, the first hint of emotion he'd shown all night. "Dad, you've written 20 years of mystery novels. Haven't you learned anything? Every perfect life falls apart when you look at the logic. Vivian knows Mom helped write The Abyss. That's why she's pushing you to divorce so fast. She's scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that one day Mom will decide she wants what's hers," Liam said. "Scared that all the money and the fame and the book deal you built on Mom's work? It could all go away." Ethan's face was ash-white now. He felt dizzy, like the floor was tilting under his feet. He'd walked into this room feeling like the hero of his own story, ready to set himself free. Now he felt like a bug under a microscope, every flaw, every lie, every cowardly choice laid bare for everyone to see. He took a deep breath. He forced his shoulders back. He was Silas Voss. He was the man who wrote the twists. He didn't lose control of the narrative. "Fine," he said, and he tried to make his voice cold, dismissive, like none of this mattered. "Even if Clara helped a little with the book, so what? Without my name, my reputation, my connections, it never would have gotten published. Vivian earned her place. She got the book the best marketing budget, the best cover, the biggest tour. That's her job. As for the $300,000? That's a business transaction between companies. You kids don't know what you're talking about. He stood up, looking down his nose at Clara, trying to recapture that old sense of superiority, that feeling that he was better than her, that he held all the cards. Clara, I'm going to say this one more time. This settlement is my final offer. The house and the 120,000? That's more than enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. As for everything else. Everything else? The voice came from the foyer. Everyone turned. A woman stood in the dining room doorway, wearing a tailored black pantsuit, thin gold-rimmed glasses, and carrying a leather briefcase. She was in her mid-40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a faint, amused smile, like she'd been listening for a while and found the whole performance very entertaining. She carried herself like she owned the place, calm and unapologetic. "Sorry to crash the party," she said, walking into the room without waiting for an invitation. "Olivia let me in. Gave me a key. Said you all might be needing a lawyer about now." It was Josephine Carter. Jo, Clara's college roommate. One of the top intellectual property and family law attorneys in the city. Ethan's stomach dropped. He recognized her. Of course he did. 5 years ago, right before The Abyss was published, he'd gotten into a fight with Midsummer Press over the contract. They'd been trying to cut his royalty rate, and he'd been furious. Clara had said, offhand, "Want me to call Jo? She could look over the contract for you. She does this stuff for a living." He'd laughed. He'd actually laughed. He'd said, "This is a literary negotiation, Clara. Not a parking ticket. I don't need a lawyer nitpicking every comma." He'd signed the contract himself. He'd come home later that night, proud as a peacock, and told her, "See? I handled it. No lawyer needed." She'd given him that look, the quiet, complicated one, and she'd said, "I'm sure you did great, Ethan." He'd never realized until that moment that she'd known exactly how bad the contract was. She'd known he was getting played. And she'd let him have his victory anyway. "Jo," Ethan said, and he tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "This is a family matter." "I don't think." "Ethan," Jo said, and her smile was sharp, friendly, and completely ruthless. She pulled a stack of papers out of her briefcase and set them down on the table, right on top of his divorce settlement. "I'm here on behalf of my client, Clara Bennett. This is a formal notice of legal claim." She tapped the top page with one manicured nail. "First, the copyright of The Abyss. Based on original manuscripts, revision notes, audio recordings of the two of you discussing plot and character, and dozens of dated draft files, we have overwhelming evidence that this is a collaborative work. Clara Bennett is a co-author, with equal rights to all proceeds from the book. Your sale of the audiobook rights without her written consent constitutes copyright infringement. We are prepared to pursue that in court along with damages." Ethan's hands started to shake. "Second, that $300,000 payment from Broadview Media. We've traced the full money trail, from Broadview to Midsummer Press, from Midsummer Press to your personal studio account, from your studio account to the down payment on a condo owned by Vivian Reed. That is a clear case of fraudulent transfer of marital property. If this goes to court, a judge will not look kindly on it." She paused, letting that sink in. "Third, the property settlement you presented tonight. Clara Bennett gave up a professional writing career to manage this household and raise your 2 children for 18 years. Under state law, she is entitled to spousal support, an equitable division of all marital assets, and compensation for her domestic labor. Your offer is not equitable. It is, frankly, insulting." She leaned forward slightly, and her voice dropped, just a little. "Oh, and while I was preparing this, I took a quick look at Midsummer Press's corporate filings and tax records. Interesting stuff. A lot of those consulting fees you've been paying out? The companies receiving them? They all trace back to Vivian Reed's family. That's the kind of thing the IRS finds very interesting." "Enough." Ethan's voice was a snarl. He slammed a fist on the table, hard enough to make the glasses rattle. His face was bright red, his jaw tight with rage and humiliation. He felt like he was being stripped naked in front of his own family. Every secret, every lie, every stupid, greedy choice was being pulled out into the light. He rounded on Clara, his eyes blazing. So this is your big plan, huh? He spat. You act all quiet and innocent for 18 years, and then you stab me in the back? You got the kids to spy on me? You got your lawyer friend to dig through my life? How long have you been waiting for this? How long have you been plotting? Clara didn't flinch. She just sat there, calm as a lake at dawn, and looked at him. For a second, he saw everything: 18 years of love, of patience, of quiet disappointment, of small, daily betrayals he'd never even noticed. And then it was gone, and she was just calm. I never plotted anything, Ethan, she said, very quietly. I just didn't tell you what I knew. She folded her hands in her lap. Joe and I have stayed in touch all these years. I never stopped reading. Never stopped thinking about writing. When the kids got older, I started writing again, late at night, after everyone was asleep. Just little things at first. Short stories. Notes for a novel. I thought my pen was rusted. Turns out it wasn't. She tilted her head, just a little. As for your finances? I didn't have to dig. You've always been terrible with money. Always been messy. Vivian's bookkeeping? It's laughable. A first-year accounting student could find the holes. I noticed years ago. I just didn't say anything. I didn't think I needed to. Her voice was never cruel. Never angry. Just steady. Matter of fact. That was the worst part. She wasn't even trying to hurt him. She was just done. Done with lying for him. Done with pretending. Done with being the quiet, invisible wife. Clara, Joe said, slipping her papers back into her briefcase, I'll head out. I just wanted to drop off the notice and make sure everything was clear. Ethan, you have 3 business days. If you want to negotiate a fair settlement out of court, call my office. If not, we'll see you in court. And, trust me, you don't want this in court. The press would love it. Best-selling author caught stealing from his own wife? That's a bestseller all on its own. She gave Clara a quick, warm smile. Call me tomorrow. We'll go over next steps. Okay, Clara said. Thanks, Joe. For coming. Anytime. Joe walked out as calmly as she'd walked in. The front door clicked shut behind her. Silence fell over the dining room again. Ethan stood there, frozen, like a statue someone had broken and glued back together wrong. He looked at the divorce papers on the table. He looked at the debit card. He looked at the legal notice sitting on top of everything. It was all so ridiculous. He'd spent months planning this night, practicing his speech, imagining how it would feel to finally be free. He'd thought he was the one holding all the cards. He'd thought he was the master of this story. Turns out he was just the villain. The stupid, arrogant villain who never saw the twist coming. Clara, he said, and his voice was raw, broken. What do you want? She stood up slowly, pushing her chair back from the table. She walked over to the big window that looked out over the backyard, over the fence, out at the neighborhood lights stretching out into the dark. For a long time, she just stood there, looking out at the world beyond her kitchen window. 18 years ago, she said, very quietly, I turned down the MFA. I turned down the book deal. I moved here with you. You said you'd take care of me. You said I'd never regret it. She paused. For 18 years, I took care of this house. I took care of the kids. I took care of you. I went to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game. I stayed up with Liam when he had pneumonia when he was 5. I helped Olivia write her college essays when you were on book tour. I fixed the water heater when it broke in the middle of winter. I paid the bills. I balanced the checkbook. I kept everything running so you could sit in your study and write. She turned around to look at him. I never regretted staying home with the kids. Never. But you don't get to use my choice against me. You don't get to take everything I gave up and call it nothing. You don't get to use my work to impress another woman and then call me boring and uneducated. Her voice was still calm. But there was steel in it now. The steel he'd forgotten was there. I want 3 things, she said. And if you agree to all 3, we can settle this quietly. No court. No press. No scandal. Just done. He stared at her. Name them. First, she said, that settlement you brought? Throw it away. We split everything fairly. Half of everything. The house, the savings, the royalties. All of it. Joe will draw up the papers. You sign them. No arguments. He flinched. Half of everything. That was a lot more than 120,000 and a beat-up old house. But he nodded. He knew he didn't have a choice. Second, she said, asterisk the abyss star. Either you add my name as co-author on every future printing, every ebook, every audiobook, every translation. Or you pull it. You take it out of print. You choose. His breath caught. Adding her name? Admitting to the whole world that his masterpiece wasn't all his? That would ruin his reputation. His fans would feel betrayed. The critics would tear him apart. He'd be a joke. But pulling the book? Losing all that revenue? That would ruin him financially. It was a choice between two kinds of destruction. And third, he said, his voice hoarse. She looked at him. And for just a second, she smiled. A small, faint, unforgiving smile. Third, she said, in your next book. In the acknowledgments. I want you to write one sentence. He swallowed. What sentence? She held his gaze. To my ex-wife, Clara Bennett. Without her, this book would not exist. The floor dropped out from under him. The acknowledgments page. The first page every reader flips to. The place where writers thank the people who matter most. For him to write that? To admit to every single person who bought his next book that he owed his career to the wife he'd cheated on and left? That was worse than any lawsuit. Worse than any fine. It was public humiliation. It was taking his carefully crafted image, the brilliant, solitary artist, and smashing it into a million pieces. You're insane, he breathed. I'm not, she said, calm as ever. I just want you to be honest. For once in your life. You spend all your time writing about the truth, about the dark secrets people hide, about how no one gets away with anything forever. So be honest. Tell the truth. Can you do that? He stared at her. He wanted to yell. He wanted to scream that she was cruel, that she was vindictive, that she was ruining his life. But he couldn't. Because he knew she was right. He'd had 18 years to be honest. He'd had every chance to give her credit, to thank her, to see her. He'd chosen not to. This was just the bill coming due. Silence spread through the room, slow and thick, like ink bleeding into paper. It seeped into every corner, every crack, every empty space between them. Ethan stood there, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was the one who didn't know the end of the story. He thought about that night, 5 years ago. The night she'd given him the idea for the villain. He thought about the way she'd stood there in his study, in her faded flannel, holding a bowl of soup, and she'd said those words about regret, about being seen. He'd thought she was talking about the character. He realized now she'd been talking about herself. Clara, he said, and his voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. If you had all this, all the evidence, the lawyer, everything, why didn't you say something sooner? Why wait until tonight? She didn't answer right away. She walked back over to the table, to Olivia and Liam, and she put a hand on each of their shoulders. The three of them stood there together, a solid wall, and Ethan felt suddenly, sharply alone. Because tonight was graduation night, she said, very simply. Because I didn't want to ruin this for them. 18 years I waited. What's 3 more days? She looked at him, and her eyes were soft now, not angry. Just tired. A mother will wait a very long time for her kids. You have no idea how long. Olivia's eyes glistened. She reached up and covered her mother's hand with her own, squeezing tight. Liam stood up and moved to stand beside her, not saying anything, just pressing his shoulder against hers. Quiet support. The kind Ethan had never given any of them. Ethan looked at the three of them, and he realized something cold and hard and true. He wasn't part of this family anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. He just hadn't noticed. So, he said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. The book. The abyss. The core idea. That was yours, wasn't it? She shook her head. No, she said. The story was yours. The characters were yours. All the hard work of writing it? That was you. I just gave you a push. Helped you find the heart of it. She paused. But Ethan? Even if someone only gives you a push? Even if they only help you find the heart of the story? Don't you think they deserve a thank you? He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there for a long time, staring at his shoes, at the floor, at the divorce papers he'd been so proud of a few hours ago. He thought about running. Thought about saying no, about fighting her in court, about trying to win. But he knew he'd lose. He knew she had him dead to rights. And deeper than that, somewhere under all the anger and humiliation and fear, he knew she was right. Fine, he said, at last. His shoulders slumped. All the fight went out of him. All three. I'll agree to all three. Good, Clara said, like she was confirming a grocery list. Joe will send over the revised settlement tomorrow. You should get your own lawyer. Look it over. Make sure everything's fair. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Why bother? You're the one holding all the cards. I'm not trying to cheat you, Ethan, she said, and she sounded almost sad. I don't want everything. I just want what's mine. What I earned. You can keep your studio. You can keep your book tour money. You can keep whatever you built on your own. But the parts one helped with? I'm taking those back. He looked up at her. She was standing there in the dining room, wearing the simple blue dress she'd put on for the graduation dinner, no makeup, her hair half falling down. The lights from the chandelier fell on her face, and for a second, he saw her again, the girl he'd fallen in love with in college, the brilliant, fierce writer who'd made him want to be better. He'd spent so many years telling himself she'd faded, that she'd become ordinary. But she hadn't faded at all. She'd just been quiet. And now she wasn't quiet anymore. Clara, he said, and he didn't recognize his own voice. Do you hate me? She thought about it. For a long time, she just stood there, looking at him. Some days, she said, honestly. But mostly? I'm sad. Sad that you never bothered to see me. Sad that you spent all that time writing about people, about their hearts and their secrets, and you never once tried to know the woman sleeping next to you. What a waste. For both of us. He had nothing to say to that. That night, he slept in the guest room. Clara sat alone in the study for a long time after everyone else had gone to bed. The room still smelled like Ethan's bourbon and old paper and ink. His desk was in the corner, cluttered with notes and half-empty mugs of cold coffee. On the bookshelf behind it, row after row of his books, all with his name on the spine. She knelt down and pulled an old cardboard box out from the back of the closet. It was covered in dust. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside were all the things she'd left behind. Her diploma from Stanford, framed. The trophy from the fiction award, tarnished a little at the edges. Old copies of literary magazines with her stories in them, the pages yellowed at the edges. At the very bottom, wrapped in brown paper, was a stack of typewritten pages. Her novel. The one she'd started writing right after they got married, right before she found out she was pregnant with Olivia. She'd written about 30,000 words, all on an old typewriter, and then she'd stopped. She'd put it in a box and put the box in the closet and told herself she'd get back to it someday. Someday had taken 18 years. She sat down on the floor and turned the pages, slow and careful. The paper was brittle. The ink had faded. But the words were still there. The characters were still there. The girl she'd been, the story she'd wanted to tell, all of it, waiting. She read for a long time. Then she stood up, wiped the dust off her hands, and sat down at the desk. She opened Ethan's laptop, he'd left it open, as usual, and created a new document. She typed 2 words at the top of the page. Equinox. The equal night. The time when light and dark are perfectly balanced. When everything shifts. This time, the name on the cover would be hers. Ethan woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing violently on the nightstand. It was still dark outside. The guest room curtains were drawn tight, letting in only a thin, gray line of dawn. He fumbled for the phone, knocking over a glass of water in the process. His head throbbed. He'd lain awake for hours, replaying every second of the night before, every humiliation, every quiet blow. The screen was full of notifications. Dozens of them. Texts, emails, missed calls. The little red badge on his messaging app kept climbing higher and higher. His stomach dropped. He tapped the first text. It was from Roger, his publicist, sent at 3:17 in the morning. *Ethan. Pick up your phone. We have a problem. A big one, asterisk. Below it was a link. Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen for a second. He had a very bad feeling about this. He tapped the link. It opened to a post on a popular entertainment gossip site, Inside the Industry, published at midnight. The headline was long, bold, designed to make you click. Best-selling suspense author Silas Voss cheats on wife with own editor, embezzles $300,000 in book royalties to buy her a house. Daughter exposes him at family graduation dinner. The article didn't use full real names, but it didn't have to. Every detail was there. The reclusive genius author, the blockbuster novel The Abyss, the soulmate editor, the $300,000 audiobook deal, the graduation dinner takedown. Anyone who paid even a little attention to the book world would know exactly who it was about. And there were pictures. Screenshots of bank transfers, redacted but readable. A copy of the condo purchase agreement, with Vivian's initials visible. Even a blurry photo of Vivian and him having lunch at a cafe downtown, taken a few months ago. Ethan's fingers went numb. He scrolled down to the comments. There were thousands of them, pouring in by the second. Asterisk Silas Voss? No way. I loved his books. I thought he was one of the good ones. Asterisk. Asterisk, soulmate my ass. Cheating is cheating. Don't dress it up like art. Asterisk. Asterisk wait, so his wife helped him write his best book and he stole the money for his mistress? That's next level garbage. Asterisk. Asterisk can we talk about the daughter though? Just graduated high school and she's out here doing forensic accounting? Iconic. Asterisk. Asterisk Silas Voss is cancelled. I'm returning my copy of The Abyss. Asterisk. The room spun. He dropped the phone on the bed. He sat there for a minute, just breathing, trying to make sense of it. Who could have leaked this? Jo? No. She was a lawyer. She wouldn't risk her license with a tabloid leak. Clara? No. She'd made it clear she wanted to settle quietly. She had nothing to gain from a public scandal. Then who? His phone buzzed again, this time with an incoming call. The name on the screen made his chest hurt. Marcus Hale. His business partner at Midsummer Press. He answered. Ethan, Marcus roared, and his voice was so loud Ethan had to hold the phone away from his ear. What the hell is going on? Do you have any idea what's happening right now? 3 of our biggest sponsors called this morning. They're pulling their ads from the book tour. Barnes & Noble is talking about moving your books to the back of the store. That gossip post has been shared 100,000 times. Marcus, I can explain. Explain what? That you've been screwing your editor and stealing royalties from your own wife? Save it. I don't want to hear it. The new book was supposed to drop next month. We've spent $500,000 on marketing already. Now every headline is about you being a cheating scumbag. We're delaying the launch. Indefinitely. Ethan closed his eyes. Marcus, come on. We can fix this. We can put out a statement. A statement saying what? Sorry I stole money from my wife and cheated on her with my editor, but please buy my book? No way. We're laying low. We're not saying anything. We let it blow over. Marcus paused, and his voice got colder. Oh, and Broadview Media called. They're reviewing the Abyss audiobook contract. They say your personal scandal is damaging the brand. If they drop it, you owe us the advance back. All of it. Don't think I won't come after you for it. He hung up. Ethan sat there, holding the dead phone, and the room kept spinning. He could hear voices from the kitchen. Clara and the kids. Talking. Laughing a little. Normal sounds. Normal morning. Like the world hadn't just ended for him. He wanted to storm out there. He wanted to yell at Clara, to accuse her of leaking the story, of trying to ruin him completely. But he didn't move. He didn't have the right. Not anymore. And deep down, he knew. Even if she hadn't leaked it, everything in that article was true. Every word. He was the villain of the story. He'd written himself into that role, one lie at a time. His phone buzzed again. This time, the name on the screen was Vivian. He stared at it. He'd ignored her calls all night. After Jo had shown up, after everything had fallen apart, he'd known. He and Vivian were over. There was no way they could come back from this. The fantasy was dead. The soulmate act couldn't survive the cold light of day. But he had to answer. Ethan, Vivian said, and her voice was sharp, shrill, nothing like the soft, understanding tone she used with him at work. Did you see that article? Who did this? Was it your wife? Did she send this to the press to get back at me? Vivian, calm down. Calm down? Do you know what they're saying about me at the office? They're saying I slept my way to the top. That I helped you embezzle money. That I'm a homewrecker. I worked for 8 years to build my reputation. 8 years. And now it's gone, just like that, because you couldn't keep it in your pants and you couldn't keep your finances straight. Ethan closed his eyes. Vivian, the article is telling the truth, he said, tiredly. The 300,000. I'm giving it back. To Clara. There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. Then Vivian laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound. Oh, I see, she said. So that's it? You're just going to roll over and give her everything? You're going to throw me under the bus to save yourself. I'm not throwing anyone under the bus, he said. I made a mistake. We both did. I have to take responsibility for it. Responsibility? She laughed again. Ethan, you're so full of it. You think this is one of your books? You think you can give a big dramatic apology and everyone will forgive you? This is real life. That article isn't just going after you. It's going after me. It's going after Midsummer Press. It's going to destroy all of us. And you think you can just take responsibility and fix it? You can't. She paused. Don't call me again, she said. And don't come to the office. I'm handling this my own way. She hung up. Ethan dropped the phone on the bed. He sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. The sun came up, slow and gray, and light seeped through the curtains and fell across the floor. He thought about the first years of their marriage. The tiny apartment they'd rented, with the leaky roof and the stove that only worked on 2 burners. He thought about Clara getting up at 5 every morning to make coffee so he could write before he went his day job at the bookstore. He thought about her editing his first manuscript by hand, in red pen, sitting on the floor because they didn't have a desk. He thought about the way she'd smiled when he told him his first book had been accepted, like it was the best thing that had ever happened to her. He hadn't thought about those days in years. Not because he couldn't remember. Because he'd chosen not to. It was easier to think of himself as a self-made man. Easier to forget that he hadn't done any of it alone. He got up. He splashed cold water on his face. He walked out into the hallway. Clara was in the kitchen, standing by the table, folding laundry. She was wearing an old gray sweatshirt and leggings, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. The radio was playing softly, an old jazz station she liked. She looked up when he walked in, and she didn't look angry. She just looked like she'd been expecting him. There's oatmeal on the stove, she said, like it was any other morning. Like they hadn't destroyed their marriage last night. It's still warm. Help yourself. Ethan stood in the doorway. He looked at her, standing there in the kitchen, folding his socks, and he felt a wave of something so big it almost knocked him over. Grief, maybe. Regret. The sharp, bitter knowledge that he'd had something perfect, something irreplaceable, and he'd thrown it away because he'd thought the grass was greener on the other side. Clara, he said, and his voice was rough. That book. The one you were writing. Before the kids. Do you still have it? Her hands stilled on the sweatshirt she was folding. She looked up at him, surprised. I do, she said. Why? Nothing, he said. He shook his head. He walked over to the stove and poured himself a bowl of oatmeal. Just wondering. He didn't say anything else. She didn't ask. He sat at the kitchen table and ate his oatmeal. It was plain, just the way he liked it, with a little brown sugar on top. It tasted exactly the same as it had 18 years ago. Everything else had changed. The gossip article stayed up for less than 3 days. Ethan never found out who got it taken down. Maybe it was Midsummer Press's legal team. Maybe it was the publisher. Maybe it was someone higher up, someone with enough money and connections to make a problem disappear. But the internet never forgets. Screenshots were everywhere. Threads popped up on every book forum. People made TikTok videos about it. The hashtag Silas Boss is over trended for 2 days. Used copies of The Abyss tripled in price on resale sites, with people calling it the most expensive cheating scandal in literary history. Ethan's new book was put on hold indefinitely. Midsummer Press released a terse, One-sentence statement saying they were reviewing their schedule and had nothing further to add. No one believed it. Vivian resigned from Midsummer Press 3 weeks later. No one tried to talk her out of it. Ethan heard through the grapevine that she'd packed up her desk on a Friday afternoon, and no one had even said goodbye. The whole office had pretended not to notice. She'd been popular once, well-liked, respected. But when the scandal broke, everyone had run for the hills. He never called her. He never tried to fix things. Because he knew, deep down, that it had never been real. Not really. Vivian had fallen for Silas Voss, the brilliant, mysterious author on the book jackets. She hadn't fallen for Ethan Bennett, the guy who left his socks on the floor, who forgot to pay the electric bill, who cried at dog commercials, who spent 3 days stuck on a single paragraph and threw his keyboard across the room. And the version of her he'd fallen for? The smart, understanding editor who got his work, who got his soul. That had been a fantasy too. The real Vivian was sharp and ambitious and angry, and she'd seen him as a step up, a way to get ahead. They'd both been lying to each other. They'd both seen what they wanted to see. It was fitting, really. A relationship built on stolen work and secret meetings and lies. It had never stood a chance. Weeks passed. Olivia got her acceptance letter to NYU, studying journalism. She'd cried when she opened it, happy tears, and Clara had held her and cried too. Liam got into MIT for computer science. He just nodded, a tiny, rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and said, "Cool." Clara had hugged him anyway. Clara didn't rush to move out. There was no point. The kids were leaving for school in a few months. She wanted to enjoy the last summer with them at home. Joe handled all the legal stuff, sending over papers, walking her through every step. The negotiations were surprisingly smooth. Ethan didn't argue. He signed everything they put in front of him, fast and quiet, like he just wanted it to be over. Joe called her once, surprised. He's not even fighting back. What happened to him? Guilt, Clara said, and her voice was quiet. It's expensive. The final settlement was fair. She got the brownstone in the city, the one they'd bought when the kids started middle school, plus a house upstate and a fair share of the savings and investments. She didn't take half of everything, not really. She left him the studio, the bulk of the future royalties, most of his retirement. She didn't want to ruin him. She just wanted to be free. Moving day came at the end of July. It was hot, bright summer day. The moving truck was parked in the driveway, and the movers carried box after box out of the house. The bookshelves came down first. Then the couch. Then the big pothose plant Clara had kept alive for 6 years, the one Ethan had always said he hated. The house emptied out, slow and steady. Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, watching it happen. He felt hollow. Like someone was reaching inside his chest and pulling out pieces of his life, one box at a time. Clara walked out of the study carrying one last cardboard box. It was small, but she held it carefully with both hands, like it was the most important thing in the world. Ethan took a step forward, his hand outstretched, like he was going to help her. He stopped halfway. He didn't have the right. Clara glanced at him. She didn't say anything about the hand. She just kept walking. She stopped at the front door. She set the box down for a second to slip on her shoes. She looked around the entryway, at the little marks on the wall where they'd measured the kids' height every year, at the chipped tile by the door, at the coat hooks that were already empty. "I paid the HA dues through the end of the year," she said, like she was leaving for a business trip, not moving out forever. "The gas bill is in the junk drawer in the kitchen, second one down. Spare key is under the mat by the back door. Don't lose it this time." Ethan's throat felt tight. "Clara," he said. She turned. "That book you're writing," he said, and his voice was rough. "The one you started again. How's it going?" She blinked. She hadn't expected that. "Good," she said. "I'm about 70,000 words in. Slow, but steady." "That's good," he said. He nodded. He stared at his shoes for a second, then looked back up. "When you finish, would you send it to me? I'd like to read it. If you want. I know I don't have the right. But I'd like to. Anyway." She looked at him for a long time. "Maybe," she said, at last. We'll see. She picked up the box. She walked out the door. The moving truck rumbled down the driveway and turned the corner. It was gone. Ethan stood alone in the empty living room. The walls were bare. The floors were scuffed. The air smelled like dust and cardboard. It was quiet. So quiet. No sound of Clara humming in the kitchen. No sound of Olivia laughing on the phone with her friends. No sound of Liam typing furiously on his computer in his room. Just silence. He'd wanted this, hadn't he? Freedom. Peace. No distractions. Just him and his writing. The life of a real artist. He had it now. It tasted like ash. 3 months later, Clara finished her novel. 120,000 words. It had taken her 18 years to write it, one stolen hour at a time. She'd changed the title at the last minute. The Abyss had been Ethan's story. This one was hers. She called it Equinox. It was the story of a woman who'd given up her writing career to raise her family, who'd spent 20 years being invisible, being just a wife and mom, until one day she ran into an old college friend and realized how much of herself she'd lost. It was about regret. About second chances. About finding your voice again when you'd forgotten you ever had one. It wasn't a thriller. There were no murders, no twists, no shocking reveals. Just a woman's life. Quiet. Ordinary. And completely, unapologetically hers. Joe had sent the manuscript to an old friend of theirs from college, Lena Marlowe, who was now a senior editor at a major publishing house. Lena was famous in the industry for being tough, for turning down 9 out of 10 manuscripts that crossed her desk, for never sugarcoating anything. Clara had waited 3 days, sick to her stomach, convinced Lena would hate it. Then the email came. 1 line at first. Asterisk Clara. This book is extraordinary. I'm buying it. Name your price, asterisk. Clara sat at her desk in her new study, in her new house, and she cried. She thought about her old professor at Stanford, the one who'd pulled her aside senior year and asked her why she was turning down the MFA. She'd told him she was getting married, that she was moving east. He'd looked at her, sad and serious, and he'd said, Clara, you have one of the most original voices I've ever taught. Promise me you won't bury it. Promise me you'll keep writing. She'd promised. It had taken her a long time to keep that promise. But she'd kept it. For Ethan, those 3 months had been the hardest of his life. He'd tried to write. He'd sat at his desk every morning, just like always, fingers on the keyboard, ready to work. Nothing came. Oh, he could type words. Sentences. Pages of them. But they were dead. Flat. The characters had no heart. The plots had no weight. Every time he tried to write a villain, all he could see was himself, standing in that dining room, getting torn apart by his own daughter. Every time he tried to write a love story, all he could hear was Vivian's cold, angry voice on the phone. Every time he tried to write about family, all he could see was Clara's back, walking out the door. He'd spent 20 years writing about other people's secrets. Now he was drowning in his own. One night, late, he'd gone digging in the back of the study closet. He'd found the old box of the Abyss drafts, the printed pages he'd kept all these years. He'd carried them out to his desk and started flipping through them. Her notes were everywhere. In pencil, in the margins. Small, neat handwriting. Asterisk, this character's motivation feels thin here. Give her a memory. Something she's holding on to, asterisk. Asterisk, this twist is perfect. I didn't see it coming until the 3rd read. Great job, asterisk. Asterisk, Ethan. The ending made me cry. You're going to blow them away, asterisk. He kept flipping. On the very last page of the very last draft, at the very bottom, almost erased, like she'd written it and then tried to rub it out, there was 1 line. Faint, but legible. I wish I could write something this meaningful someday. Just a quiet, secret wish. Scrawled in pencil on the back of her husband's manuscript. A dream she'd hidden from everyone, even him. Ethan sat there and stared at that line for a very long time. 18 years. He'd spent 18 years writing, and she'd spent 18 years reading. He'd spent 18 years being seen, and she'd spent 18 years being invisible. He'd never once stopped to wonder what she wanted. What she dreamed about. What she wrote when no one was looking. He'd been so busy being the writer, he'd never noticed the writer sitting right next to him. Outside, the sun went down. The city lights came on, one by one. He picked up his phone. He opened his messages. He typed a text to Clara. Asterisk, heard you sold your book. Congratulations. You deserve it. Asterisk. He stared at it for a minute. Then he hit send. He didn't expect a reply. He didn't deserve one. 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Thank you. That was it. Just 2 words. Ethan looked at that message for a long time. Then he set the phone down. He closed the draft of his new book, the one he'd been struggling with for months, the one about a detective with a dark past, and deleted all of it. Every last word. He opened a blank document. The cursor blinked at the top of the page. He didn't want to write about murder anymore. He didn't want to write about twists and secrets and villains. He wanted to write about her. About the woman he'd married. The woman he'd failed. The woman he'd spent 18 years not seeing. He wanted to write the story of the girl who'd given up everything for love and then found her way back to herself. It was the hardest story he'd ever write. And it was the only one that mattered. He took a deep breath. He started typing.